That's hard. I don't. That's what I've never understood is the way of thinking that can make you believe that basically imperialism, aggressive imperialism, is okay. That it's fine to do that, or it's justified, or it makes sense. I've never followed that logic. I get that people think that. I just don't get how they get there. I don't understand how they get to that point where it's like, well, yeah, we invaded that country, but we had to, or it was a good idea, or they deserved it, or I don't follow that part of it. But it seems to be in many countries sort of on the rise, a resurgence of nationalism and this sense of we'll us first. We'll look for our interests first and not worry. I suppose it's a reaction to globalism, yes. I mean, that makes sense, right? Because in many ways, I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here having a conversation is a sign of how far globalism has progressed, It's not a strange or exotic thing that we're just sitting here chatting tonight, There's nothing strange for us about this, but if you think in terms of, Japan's on one side of the world, U.S. is on the other side of the world, we come from different languages, entirely different histories and backgrounds. How do we end up in the same room at the same time and have it not be that big a deal, That's a sign of globalism, and I don't see how you undo that.
Yeah. I think we are moving toward a globalized world, but at the same time, the kind of nationalistic or more xenophobic atmospheres, environment also emerge, kind of to resist such kind of globalization. Yeah, in Japan also, in the States maybe, and also in Europe.
Yeah. In Europe, Russia is being very nationalistic these days. I can't think of too many. Well, Canada seems to be going the other way right now. Canada is very odd these days. They're very liberal. They're very open. They're very welcoming. Everybody else is like becoming right wing and really I don't know. It's interesting. It's all interesting, but. Forgot what I was going to say. I was going to try to maneuver around to immigration again in some way. Have you studied much about in Japan? You don't study Japanese history at all, really?
I didn't study much about Japanese history when I was in Japan. I didn't like history when I was a high school student.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, before starting history in grad school. Yeah.
What was the change? What made it interesting for you?
Because when I was in Japan, I guess it was like the process of memorizing what happened at what time. For example, in 1945, Japan surrendered, or something like that. Kind of just memorizing what happened in which year. But so I thought it was kind of boring. It's just memorizing. But when I was in grad school in Japan, I learned that history is not just one thing. We have some facts, but our interpretations are different. Even if we see the same documents or same materials, our interpretations are totally different. Some people say, how can I say it? It's like kind of even if we see the same materials, we reach the totally different conclusions. And I thought history is like art. It's like there is no the history.
Yeah,
history is more like kind of more different.
No, a history. It means.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a kind of variety of histories. There is no the history.
Yeah.
And I can write my history is my kind of writing history is different from other people's writing history, even if we see the same document, same period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's why I'm interested in history. It's like an art and creating something new, and yeah, so and also history changes. Yeah, history is not static, not fixed. It's kind of changing, more flexible. Yeah, so that's why I'm interested in history.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when I became interested in it. I've always liked old things. I've always liked the past,
Yes.
in some sense, and I've always been interested in. I guess, in some way, I've always thought of it as this is how we got here. Like,
Yeah.
okay, this is
Yeah.
now, but how did we get here? Like, if you start thinking about that, like this building, for example, this used to be the post office. This was an office. We're sitting in somebody's office right now who used to work in the post office. It's just, you start to get this sense of like, this is what creates the stage upon which we act out the present. That's what history is. And I think I've always been interested in history, but I never was that interested in learning history as it was taught in school. I wanted to know other kinds of history, other things about history that they didn't teach. They seemed to be so intent on giving you dates.
Yeah.
This
Yes.
person did this
Yes.
on this date, and that made this happen. It seemed like such a, not inhuman, because in a way it's almost too human. It makes individual people and their actions somehow become so much more important than the inertia of millions of people all moving sort of in a general direction. That's what makes things happen. There may be people that at turning points, or who do, like the one on top of the hill, you have a pile of people, and the one on top, that's the one we learn about. We don't learn about all those people that are piled up underneath. We learn about the one on top, or the one who was at the corner when everybody turned, or whatever, as if that was the person that made that happen. But it isn't. Those are just people who were there when these things were happening. And I guess I never really felt connected to the way history was taught to me, anyway. But then again, like I was saying, history was very westernized. The history I learned, it started in Greece, and then went to Rome, and then to England, and then to the U.S. I mean, that was like the trajectory. There was stuff that happened before then that was kind of interesting and weird, but it didn't really have anything to do with anything, because history began with the Greeks. That's Western history, and at least in my era, that was, Western civilization was civilization. There were other things that called themselves civilizations, but they weren't really civilized. It was so one-sided that it wasn't very interesting.
Yeah.
So I guess all of this is a sort of a weird way of reacting to your interest in American history, because that was always the history I liked the least. Was American history growing up. So
but I like the, as you said, I mean, the American history is more like, or is taught, or is studied in the context of kind of Western civilization, or the rise and fall of Western powers. But I am interested in kind of deconstructing such, Eurocentric framework. What I want to do in for example, my dissertation is try to put the U.S. in the context of more globalized context. For example, the Japanese people impact the American history, or other people, or from, for example, Asian countries or African countries shaped or reshaped U.S. kind of experiences or U.S. history. So, I like U.S. history that is taught in the framework of Europe or the the U.S. itself, but I also want to think about the U.S. history in more broader kind of framework, how Asians, how Africans, how, Middle Eastern people impact or kind of constructed or participated in shaping U.S. history or kind of U.S. experiences.
That's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah.
Because one of the aspects of genius of Western culture, I guess you want to, maybe that's not the right word, is the ability to co-opt and mold and shape and take over things. So I like your glasses. So okay, well, I'm going to change something about it, and I will invent this new style of glasses that I'll put my own name on, and then before you know it, they came from you, but I'm the one that, because of my entrepreneurial thing, you didn't think to sell it. I will think to market this thing, Tom's glasses, and suddenly it's mine. And history will remember me as the inventor of this thing that came from you. And, blues, jazz, all these different things that are American are not American. They didn't start here. They did, or they may have come about while they were here, but they didn't come from America. They came from that brilliant way, if I can use that word, of borrowing and adapting and co-opting that Westerners have. That I think that probably learned that from the British, because they did a lot of that too in their empire days. They were inventing things like I don't know, like curry. The British thing called curry. But even the British still had this sort of sense of where things came from, whereas Americans don't even bother with that. They just steal it and call it something else, and it becomes their own. So that's going to require a lot of research on your part, I think. That'll be fascinating. I would love to read that when you get it finished.
Thanks.
I don't know how. I probably will. I won't understand some of it, but I would be fascinated by that, because I have been part of that. I was in the music business. I know that borrowing and reinventing things. It just seemed like a natural process to me, because that's how I grew up thinking about it. But when I think of cultural appropriation now, I see it all over the place, and I see how it works and what's going on. That's kind of strange and interesting. You're frowning. No?
I'm interested in it, but I'm an anthropologist, not a historian. So, but I'm interested in how to make documents. The historian always depend on the document which they decide who historian make history, but not in the imagination, but always depend on the document something. So, but for me, documentary itself made by people.
Right.
So writing and how to control, how to keep. So documentary itself is history, under the history. So how to, and also if you learn about Japan under the American occupations, if like that. And after World War, Second World War. But the document, many documents are there, recording are there, but it's under the American government. So it's not easy to access. So how 50 years I cannot access, but after 50 years could open for more people like that. So history means how to make document, I think one thing. And how to depend on that. And the other thing is who make history for who. So it's interesting. You said art, but art means more under the politics. Art. So for as an anthropologist, I'm interested to make how to make a document, because I learned I did fieldwork in Bangladesh, and I'm interested in the British India about that. So I stayed 1 year. I learned to research about the documents and the British library, but it is indeed history. British library, a lot of documents are there, but it means document is open for everybody, but how to make documents in the colonial officer correct and make a statistic data. So it's important how to make statistics data, how to account people, how to categorize people like that. The data itself is under the politics. So I'm interested in the process, how to make documents, how to people make history, how to try to make a document, how to keep it, how to control people, how to make history. Such a kind of process for me very interesting. But it is not a history, but a more history of control populations, people, like that.
Yeah.
So probably his research also like that. There is a fact, they are not like that. How make the document under the control of the politics, and who make the documents, and how he said its interpretation is different, and the same document are there, but the interpretation different, interpreted possible, interpretation possible. It's because document itself not neutral.
No.
So he learned the process to make document, how happened to make document like that. So his work is complicated, I think.
I think so, yeah. And even given the whole idea of history and documentation is a new, not entirely new, but it has been growing into something. Because the farther back you go, the way people recorded history is different. A lot of it was storytelling. A lot of it was providing moral lessons or life lessons for future generations. So early history, if is my understanding, was more here's a sort of a manual for how to live life. Here's how to be a good person or a hero or a bad person. This, whatever those things are, that's what those stories were used for. They weren't supposed to be literal. Like now, it's like at 2:00 this happened. At 6:00 this person came in and said that. Now we try so hard to make everything, to base everything on objective facts. As I understand it. So that's what you're talking about, documentation. Well, I need to find something written that somebody said this is what happened, And then you have primary evidence, things from that period, secondary evidence, things written about that period, on down that way. But history, the farther back you go, the less reliable, in a modern sense, anything is. Yeah. So it's interesting, and then, like you say, everybody who's producing data and documents has an agenda of some sort. Either they work for the government and they're providing the kind of information the government wants in the way the government wants to possess it, or they're academics. So I think it would be very, very hard to do that, to do that kind of work. Because how do you know? You've got a document, you've got a book, you've got an artifact that you dug up. How do you know its context? How do you know who generated it and why and what for? And where does that come from? In other words, it's really hard.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. It's very difficult. I mean, that's what I learned through the last 3 years here. I mean, we should not read the text as it says, I mean, we should not accept text at its face value. I
Right.
mean, we need to be very critical. We need to think about the context that documents are created. Actually, it is over kind of politics. It's over there must be some intentions behind creating some documents.
Yeah.
And in my case, I kind of usually use the kind of government documents or the documents written by elites, but those documents those documents seem kind of very reliable, but we need to read the documents very critically. And also in using the documents necessarily excludes some people or marginalize some people, and I should be more careful about how others left records or how others kind of try to make them hard or I mean, try to kind of say something about their experiences. So I should not, or historians should not rely on one document or try to be more kind of try to look at the as broad as possible, not just looking at the elite people or kind of government people, but also look at the kind of marginalized people or more kind of common people. So the how to read documents or who created documents, very important question, very difficult to interpret such documents.
What really is interesting to me is to try to imagine how historians from the future are going to document present times going forward, because whereas in the past you had just this very limited, maybe somebody's diary, maybe some government records, and maybe some other like random things like people writing down, keeping track of what kinds of goods were bought and sold or whatever. Those were the kinds of things you had to go with. Now virtually everybody, writes about themselves, talks about themselves, takes pictures of themselves. We have social media. We have all these. You were just talking about this today. We were having a conversation about social media and how people present themselves on social media, which is, in the case of the person you were talking about, was very different from the person you knew versus how they portray themselves, like this is me versus this is me. It's almost like we immediately switched in a very short period of time from having very little documentation to work with to so much that I don't even know how you would begin to tell the story of today, a few years from now, unless you're here. How would you know what's fantasy, what's fiction, what's wishful thinking? We talk about fake news. We hear about that a lot on there. There's a lot of that now. Everybody's generating. It's so easy to generate documents these days that everyone is doing it, and everyone has a different reason for doing it. And it's just fascinating. I wish I could live another 100 or 200 years so I could see how they talked about now, because it just, having lived as long as I have lived, it's been interesting to look back and see people looking back at what to them is history and to me is just a few years ago. It's interesting enough. The differences are noticeable to me. When people talk, we work on a project writing about the 1960s. I was around in the 1960s, so. We have these documents from the 60s. They strike me one way because I was there and I knew the ways people presented themselves, but they probably strike you in a different way because you were too young to be aware of that. Well, young enough. I mean, it's just enough of a difference. But, that's not that long ago, and there's a lot of documentation there. I'm not really making a point. I'm just thinking it's just kind of interesting to me to imagine how a future historian would even go about.
Right.
doing it? What do you search for? Where do you search?
So I think it is more important to show the process of the research. That we believe the history just a result, and there's a fact like that. But now, as you said, the everybody can do it. But so, how historian make such kind of history? How he write like that? The background and I think the positionality we talked about the positionality. Each document make who is the person who made the document also. It depends on the or influenced by the positionality. But also the writer, also the positionality is very important. Who he is, Koji-san, who he is. It's if Americans, the American person writes the same history, could be the different way they interpret it or like that.
Yeah.
But so that not only for the result, always the process more important than before, I think. And it is the same way the anthropologist or anthropologists so many years ago so criticized about the positionality and always anthropology and the colonization is always get together and grow up under the colonization. So so sensitive for who I am. Why I could research for what? For the document for whom? Like that, I think that the history also the same things. I think it's my opinion.
Maybe.
Yeah,
well,
maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's very interesting. We are approaching the end of the show.
Yeah.
Is there anything about your work or your future? Any plans for the new year you want to share with the listening audience?
Yeah, so my goals, I guess my biggest goal is to finish the preliminary exams.
Yeah.
I have 3 preliminary exams next semester. And my first exam is in February and 2 others in April. Yeah, if I pass these exams, I could go anywhere for my research. Yeah, so the biggest goal is to pass those exams without any problem. And
you'll do fine.
Yeah. Thanks. And start my research, maybe in Alaska or in Japan, in DC.
Alaska.
Yeah, yes.
It's cold up there.
Yes, it's cold. Yeah, but I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It should be interesting. I had a friend who worked up in Alaska and up around the Arctic Circle in Canada a lot, doing biological work of some sort. I forget what she did. It was some sort of looking for disease vectors of certain kinds of diseases that were in, like reindeer and other animals. So they'd follow around to see like where they went. Said it was very cold.
Yeah.
Very, very cold. And unpleasant in all sorts of ways, but interesting, beautiful in a rugged way.
Yeah.
If you can stand it,
Yes.
A lot of fortitude. Well, are these tests like a lot of memorizing things?
Yeah. I think memorizing, and also I kind of need to think about some problems. I mean, in studying U.S. history or teaching U.S. history, and so it's like kind of pedagogical purpose. Also, how do I teach, for example, U.S. history, also global history? How do I kind of contextualize this history in global kind of context? Yeah, so it's more like memorize and also think about kind of critically about the state of the U.S. history.